I often say that my professional life cannot be separated from my personal trajectory because migration is not just a biographical detail. It shapes how you enter rooms, how you are read, and what is expected of you before you even speak. I started my career in Istanbul, first as an artist and then very early on as a museum director. At that time, my reference points were not framed through migration yet. Istanbul was complex, layered, contradictory, but it was familiar. When I began working internationally and later moved to Vienna, that changed. In Austria, my background became visible in a very specific way. I was often invited into conversations as the Turkish curator or the curator from Turkey or so-called Middle East, whether I wanted that role or not. Sometimes this visibility opened doors, especially when institutions wanted to address topics like migration, cultural difference, or geopolitical tensions. But just as often, it came with limitations. There were moments when I felt subtly categorized, as if my intellectual curiosity, my research interest, and my curatorial imagination were assumed to be primarily about where I came from. Meanwhile, curators born in, for example, Central Europe were free to work on any topic, any geography, any conceptual framework without being asked to justify it. This does not always appear as open discrimination. More often, it shows up as expectations to explain, to translate, to represent, expectations to take on emotional labor that is not evenly distributed, and very often expectations to do more work for less visibility or less compensation. At the same time, though, Vienna gave me something extremely valuable because I was not embedded in local power structures or long-standing cultural rivalries. I could move differently. Not knowing the gossip or the unspoken rules sometimes became an advantage, I would say. I could enter conversations with curiosity rather than, let's say, loyalty. That distance allowed me to build unexpected collaborations and to approach institutions with a certain clarity. When I later moved to New York, the shift was profound. I did not carry the same historical weight with me. The history didn't have the country didn't have the same history with Turkey. Nobody expected me to represent Turkey in the same way or the region. I was suddenly one international curator among many others, and that was genuinely liberating. But categorization did not completely disappear. It simply changed form. In the American context, I was often read as a white European woman, something I had never experienced before. Um, that moment was both strange and revealing. It showed me how relative identity is and how deeply it depends not only on the context you are placed in, but also where you come from into that context. I think it is important to say this very clearly. My experience in the United States is not comparable to the experiences of people coming from BIPOC communities. If I were perceived, let's say, as a Mexican woman, for example, my experience here would be different. If I were a visibly Muslim woman, my professional life and my everyday interactions also would be shaped very differently. In the US, again, I'm largely read as a white woman, and that position comes with a form of protection and privilege. Although I do not feel that this category truly represents me. The fact that I am no longer constantly othered or discriminated against is directly connected to that perception. It is very important to understand your privileges, to understand what privilege is and how you start working with that in your curatorial concepts. This also means that I cannot access certain forms of funding or affirmative mechanisms designed to counter structural inequality, for example. But the absence of continuous discrimination is itself a significant privilege, especially when I compare it to my experience in Austria, shaped by the country's specific history with Turkish migration and with what the Middle East represents in that context. What stayed consistent across all these places was the need to constantly negotiate visibility, legitimacy, and authorship. Migration shaped my professional life, not only through obstacles, but also through a heightened awareness of power, access, and responsibility. It taught me to listen carefully, to question assumptions, and to remain attentive to voices that are often sidelined or silenced. We live in a century defined by movement. Migration, displacement, and hybridity are no longer exceptions. They are structural realities. Many societies have already become migration societies, whether they acknowledge it or not. Art institutions, however, are still catching up. On the surface, there has been a visible shift. Many institutions now speak the language of diversity, inclusion, and representation. We see more exhibitions addressing migration, identity, colonial histories, and global entanglements. This is important and it should not be dismissed, especially within the current political climate, both in the United States and in Europe. But when you look more closely, the transformation is uneven. Multicultural content is often welcomed at the level of programming, but not always reflected in institutional structures. Leadership positions, for example, decision-making bodies, and long-term curatorial roles still tend to be far less diverse. One of the major risks in this situation is generalization. In my opinion, institutions often speak about communities as if they were unified or coherent groups, when in reality they are internally complex, shaped by class, gender, religion, generation, and political histories. With these nuances, when these nuances are overlooked, representation can easily slip into simplification, even when intentions are good. I think this is very important to think. Language is another telling example. Institutions in Austria, for instance, may use English and German fluently and sometimes Eastern European languages, but rarely consider Arabic, Turkish, or other languages spoken by a large part of their actual audiences. This reveals a gap between who institutions claim to address and who they are truly built for. This is also where curatorial methods become crucial. In my own practice, working with oral histories and personal memories has been a way to resist the tendency to generalize. Public discourse often relies on statistics, headlines, and abstract categories. Oral histories, by contrast, foreground specificity, contradiction, and lived experience. They allow us to engage with people not as representatives of an identity group, but as individuals situated within particular social and historical contexts. There is also a question of depth. Are transcultural perspectives integrated into an institution's core values, or are they treated as thematic additions? This is very important. A single exhibition cannot carry the burden of structural change without shifts in hiring practices, governance, and institutional culture. These efforts remain fragile. That said, audiences are also changing. Younger generations are far more comfortable with complexity, with layered identities, and with difficult histories. Institutions that do not respond to this reality risk becoming irrelevant. The pressure for change is not only ethical, but also existential. What I propose here is what I call radical relevance. By this, I mean institutions that are not only representative, but meaningfully useful to the communities they claim to serve. Radical relevance requires institutions to ask difficult questions of themselves. Who is this space really for? Who feels welcome here and who does not? What kind of knowledge are valued? What kinds of knowledge are valued? And which forms of lived experience are still considered marginal? Radical relevance is not about chasing audiences or simplifying content. It is about building trust, long-term relationships, and a sense of shared ownership. It means working with communities rather than displaying them. It means accepting discomfort, friction, and disagreement as signs of democratic engagement rather than risks to be avoided. Only institutions that are willing to take this responsibility seriously can remain alive, responsive, and necessary in the world we are living in my opinion. Yes, but it requires patience, strategy, and collective effort. Individual heroism is not enough. Curators and cultural workers can intervene at multiple levels. Through programming, we can insist on complexity rather than simplification. We can challenge dominant narratives by introducing artistic practices that question power, memory, and belonging. But transformation also happens behind the scenes. It happens in how teams are formed, how collaborations are credited, how budgets are distributed, and how care is practiced within institutions. These decisions may seem administrative, but they shape institutional ethics. One of the most important tools we have is alliance building. Change becomes possible when curators, educators, technicians, administrators, and artists recognize their shared vulnerabilities within cultural systems. Institutions often benefit from our fragmentations. Solidarity disrupts that. It's also crucial to know when transformation from within is no longer possible. Sometimes the most ethical choice is to work outside institutional frameworks or to create parallel structures that model different values. Both strategies are necessary and neither is inherently superior. The biggest risk is instrumentalization. When transcultural practices are reduced to labels that attract funding or visibility, their critical force is weakened. There is a danger that institutions select projects not for their depth, but for how they will fit diversity metrics or marketing narratives. In such cases, complexity becomes inconvenient. Conflict becomes undesirable. Artists and curators may feel the pressure to produce work that is legible, digestible, and non-threatening. This flattening affects both content and process. Transcultural work requires time, trust, and sustained engagement. It cannot be rushed or packaged easily. When these conditions are not respected, the work risks becoming symbolic rather than transformative. Resisting this requires ethical clarity. Curators must be willing to protect artists and cultural workers and collaborators and communities from being instrumentalized, and even when institutional incentives push in that direction. That is not always easy, especially in precarious working conditions, but it is necessary. Political influence rarely appears as direct censorship. More often, it manifests through funding structures, risk management, and implicit expectations. Institutions may avoid certain topics because they fear public backlash, loss of funding, or political scrutiny. Migration, colonial violence, and contested histories are often framed as too sensitive or too polarizing. Curators are then asked to balance the critical integrity with institutional survival. This is a real tension, and it should not be romanticized. Decisions are often made under pressure when limited resources are competing responsibilities. What matters is transparency. Institutions should be honest about their constraints, and curators should be clear about their ethical boundaries. Silence is not neutrality. Avoidance is a political position in itself. Diversity is often welcomed when it aligns with existing power structures. Voices that are critical but not disruptive are easier to include. Those that challenge economic interests, national myths, or institutional authority are more likely to be excluded. Radical, uncomfortable, or unresolved positions are frequently framed as too divisive. This reveals that diversity is sometimes used to stabilize systems rather than to question them. True plurality means accepting disagreement, friction, and uncertainty. It means allowing space for voices that do not offer easy resolutions. Yes, but the differences are not absolute. Public institutions often face pressure to uphold national narratives or public values. Private institutions may be constrained by sponsors, collectors, or market considerations. Both contexts evolve compromises. The key difference lies in accountability. Public institutions are accountable to citizens, while private institutions are accountable to donors or boards. In both cases, courage depends less on the institution's status and more on the individuals within it. Leadership matters, so does collective responsibility. We are entering a period of political and economic instability. In many places, we see conservative backlash and shrinking cultural budgets. This will make transcultural work more difficult, but also more necessary. If institutions retreat, artists and curators will create alternative spaces. We already see this happening through collectives, independent platforms, and transnational collaborations. Technology will play a role, but physical gathering will remain crucial. Shared spaces, however fragile, are essential for trust and solidarity, in my opinion. For me, solidarity among curators and cultural workers cannot be abstract. It has to be practiced, sustained over time, and grounded in shared responsibility rather than visibility or branding. Curators can begin to transform institutions only when they stop operating as isolated individuals and start recognizing their collective position within cultural systems. Precarity, censorship, underpayment, and instrumentalization are not personal failures, they are structural conditions. Building power means naming these conditions together and refusing to normalize them. One way this happens is through long-term networks that cross borders, disciplines, and professional identities. My involvement with Women Mobilizing Memory is one example of this kind of transcultural solidarity. Banu Karaca, who is also presenting in this session, is part of that group as well. It's a transnational network of cultural workers, academics, and activists who work with oral histories, memory, and social justice across very different geopolitical contexts. What is crucial in this kind of network is that it is not built around representation or speaking on behalf of others. Instead, it creates frameworks for listening, for shared learning, and for mutual accountability. Knowledge circulates horizontally rather than being centralized or owned. Expertise is understood as situated, partial, and relational. Working in this way has shaped how I understand curatorial responsibility. Solidarity is not about consensus. It often involves disagreement, discomfort, and difficult conversations, especially when working across different historical traumas and power asymmetries. But that friction is productive. It prevents simplification and forces a deeper engagement with nuance. These kind of networks also offer practical support. They allow cultural workers to share resources, strategies, and care at moments when institutions fail to do so. They create spaces where critical work can continue even when funding disappears or political pressure increases. The current global climate, where authoritarian tendencies, nationalism, and censorship are growing, this kind of organizing becomes essential. Institutions may retreat, but relationship can endure. Curators can act as connectors, facilitators, and allies, helping to sustain practices that might otherwise isolated or silenced. For me, the question is no longer whether we should organize in this way, but how intentionally we do it. Either we invest in solidarity across borders and differences, or we allow our work to be fragmented and weakened by the very systems we are trying to critique. Thank you.
I want to qualify my comments by first saying a few words about the perspective that I'm coming from. I've been doing long-term research on the German and Turkish arts worlds within an international context. Specifically, I've been looking at how state violence shapes such art worlds, that is, the production, circulation, and presentation of art. More recently, I've turned to the question of restitution of dispossessed art, looking at artworks that have been quote unquote lost, looted, confiscated, or sold under duress, and how this loss has shaped the writing of art histories, especially with regard to the Turkish post-Ottoman, late Ottoman context, and how that sort of reverberates in the writing of Ottoman or Islamic art histories on a more international scale. And I should also say that in doing that work, I'm not coming at it from a question of if or which works should be restituted, but rather think about restitution as the first step in transforming the ways in which we make knowledge on art, on heritage, and hence the past. So the question, to what extent space is being made for multiculturalism and transculturalism in arts institutions, is difficult to answer in the absolute. It's often one step forward and two steps back. On the one hand, we have witnessed how questions of diversity have moved to the center of mission statements of arts institutions after very, very hard fought and long-standing battles and advocacy work by those who have been marginalized in the national frame, or in what anthropologist Kira Kosnick has called the whiteness of cultural policy. So it's been really thanks to the people who've struggled for recognition. And yet, as I think will repeatedly emerge in the conversation we're having today, the conditions under which such recognition or inclusion occurs is also important to consider. Especially since we're going through an era, through a period where this kind of space is also being revoked, both throughout Europe and the US, with rising authoritarianism and right-wing movements. We are experiencing a massive backlash. It's always a bit easier to talk about places far away, but we know in the US, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives have been quite spectacularly almost attacked under the Trump administration. And problematic as these practices might have been, they were still important to ensure a certain kind of representation, although representation as such doesn't necessarily mean emancipation or freedom or equality or equity. Political, what we can see is, though, that even when space is ostensibly being made for transculturalism, I think, which is the term you prefer, it's always done in a way that political inequalities continue to be translated into idioms of cultural difference. Cultural difference remains posed as a problem to be answered, not by politics, but by arts and culture in many ways. In this context, the question is, what does the concept of transculturalism that you work with have to offer? And your invitation has animated me to consider this in different terms, how it might offer a way forward, or perhaps might still end up reproducing inequalities, especially when translated into official cultural policies. What we see a lot is that there's an appropriation of critical vocabularies under the direction of marketability as a way to retain interpretive authority and thus power overall. And I'll talk a little bit about examples as we go on. But Orientalism and exotization continues to work, even if more refined, and has taken on sometimes even the vocabulary of post-colonial critique, or by emptying it of all its meaning, and trying to sort of recuperate the critical potential. I think what's important to keep in mind is who is in the positions of making the decisions of what is being shown, what is being supported, and under which circumstances. I think you are also concerned with the question of how much autonomy people can have once they are appointed to these institutions as curators, as program makers, or to funding committees, for instance. What we see very often, I think, within the German context is that even when people come from backgrounds and usually occupy positions that would be, as it's so often called in the German-speaking context, represent a kind of migration background of different generations, perhaps. They are very often, once they're integrated into the official cultural institutional system, asked to buy into official discourses, to be able to retain their position. So while art can experiment and model with social critique, it's also important what happens outside of these institutions. Even if they show a very critical kind of program, if it's not supported by a kind of politics that's also outside of these institutional frames, be it through self-organizing by artists and cultural workers or by society at large, it's bound or runs the risk of not being able to bring about transformative change, runs the risk of occupying the space of lip service, of performative diversity, of being more of a space of taming difference rather than reinscribing long existing power relations. So language is an interesting marker here, as you note, but along with hiring policies overall, once again, the question is who is sitting in decision-making positions? Are programs made by us, for us, so to speak, for different communities? In Germany, what I can say is that we still see a winner-take-all model. So there are persons with migration background, or what is generally being called diverse backgrounds in some key positions, but usually it's sort of one in theater, one perhaps in an arts institution, or a couple. And it also sets up a system of competition, of course, and leads and continues to sort of sustain the kind of underrepresentation of people with migration backgrounds, as it's called again in German-speaking contexts. The question of how prepared or how willing arts institutions prove themselves in acknowledging that societies have been migration, sort of increasingly are characterized by immigration of different sorts, of different kinds, and also from different time periods, is a sort of larger field or difficult question. I want to give some examples in which the acknowledgement of this fact is also being turned in anti-emancipatory politics. For instance, in the framework of restitution, there's an often used argument which seems to acknowledge immigration societies, as we call them, again in the German context. For instance, by Neil MacGregor, who was the former director of the British Museum and then director of the Humboldt Forum from 2015 to 2018, I believe, who has argued against restitution of looted artworks, historical artifacts, by saying that globalization and immigration have already brought potential claimants into the hearts of Western metropoles, where they can now enjoy, as he says, what anthropologist Adam Cooper has recently described as the prizes and surprises of their former homes in the form of world heritage. So here the presence of migrants is seen as supporting the long-standing claims of greater access by Western museums at a time when the existence of immigrants are rendered precarious on a daily basis. We also see, for instance, to use another example from Germany, that the far-right Alternative für Deutschland, who has now since February 2025 is now the second largest party in parliament, has made the arts a pronounced field of interest and advocates, non-surprisingly, to a return to a decidedly German art. What that exactly is unsure. And they're not really spelling it out, but what they are spelling out is both on the local, municipal, and state levels. They have used their power to target arts events and artists who speak out against the AfD, for instance, through harassment, hate speech, and legal defamation suits. They're also building their own cultural foundations, which is poised to fund arts and cultural projects in the near future. But they have also adopted another practice of, which is called in German, kleine Anfrage, minor interpellation or inquiry, to inundate, for instance, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also cultural departments throughout Germany, to ask about where funding is going, why, for instance, arts and cultural funding is going abroad, or like in the example of Baden-Württemberg, they wanted to know the nationalities breakdown of the local theater to understand how many quote-unquote Germans were actually employed. A similar inquiry was recently made with regard to the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin, insinuating that their programming and hiring policies systematically discriminated against white Germans. So here we see actually how the question of multiculturalism is once again sort of weaponized to argue that it's the majority of society was being marginalized by these different kind of policies now. What I would also like to add is, of course, I've already talked about the backlash against but we also, of course, are witnessing a major wave of discourses on so-called remigration and more general acceptance of deportations as a tool of politics when it comes to immigration. So my fear is that the much to be criticized yet hard-won advances are also at great risk. So when I was writing my book, The National Frame, I sort of was struck that while transnationalism and globalization have increasingly been at the forefront of both artistic practices and the scholarly analysis of art, and for good reason, it's remains striking that the idea of the emancipatory potential of art, the way it's formulated in cultural policy, has been intrinsically bound up with the history of the nation state and hence understandings of what it means to be modern, indeed what it means to be civilized. So I've been always wrestling with this paradox within a globalist art world, that dominant understandings of art remain refracted through the national frame, and we only see this really in moments of crisis. A crisis like we're going through right now or have been going through for the past couple of years. So to give an example, despite the transnational networks of peoples, monies, and things that characterize the intensified circulation of art and artists under the auspices of globalization, the national arena continues to delimit the boundaries of what is deemed acceptable or imaginable in the arts. So censorship works largely through the national prism. And although we've seen after the October 7th attacks by Hamas and then the genocidal violence that has been unleashed on Gaza, we see a sort of international trend. But at the same time, the way in which this plays out is always based on national policies and the kind of restrictions that we've experienced. And I'll try to detail that later a little bit more. You also asked if themes like climate crisis and sustainability that are very popular in EU funding are sort of suspiciously and not surprisingly often leaving out the issue of colonialism and capitalism proper in terms of critique. And you were asking if this sort of is done with wanting to have a kind of controlled opposition, rather than truly giving room for truly radical projects. And I think we've been seeing this emptying out of meaning, the kind of recuperation of critical concepts or the appropriation of critique in ways that are quite harrowing. I always think of the example that in 2016, the German History Museum in Berlin. So I always think of the example of the German colonialism exhibition in 2016 at the German Historical Museum in Berlin, that was celebrated as finally addressing the legacies of German colonialism and eventually turning it into a permanent part of the exhibition. And yet what we could witness during the opening was that groups like Berlin Postkolonial and other Afro-German grassroots actors who had long been doing the very difficult and hard advocacy work to make this a topic for places like the German History Museum were not invited to the opening. Indeed, that they were standing outside protesting in the rain, while the attendees were sort of celebrating this breakthrough. So we see this kind of recuperation over and over again. But it's also, colonialism is one part of that. We can also see it in areas like digitization, for instance. So on the one hand, there's really a big push for arts and cultural institutions of different scales to talk about sustainability and the climate crisis. But at the same time, I'm thinking of the example of the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz, which is the largest German cultural foundation, which sort of oversees most of the museums in Berlin, for instance. They are investing a lot in digitization, which is supposed to bring about accessibility, an openness for research, an engagement of the public. But at the same time, they're not considering really the ecological footprint. They're really investing heavily in AI, which is supposed to be facilitating the research, but also still not really telling us how this kind of open access that they keep talking about is going to be realized, especially given that so many researchers tend to have problems accessing resources still. I think it might be worth taking a little bit of a longitudinal view on these questions. Although multiculturalism is not a term that's really used anymore, I would say that there's a definite continuity between notions of multiculturalism that sort of became established or emerged in the later 1980s, and the diversity turn that we've been witnessing since the 2000s have been mainly about, I would say, taming difference rather than looking at the political potential of difference and of the call that is sort of inherent in difference in a society. Even if it's been different presets, of course, when we talk about the last 30, 40 years, we talk about different political conjunctures. And yet I think that's been one of the main features of both multiculturalism and diversity has been about taming difference rather than exploring its political potential. Both of these turns or discourses have been, to put it quite shortly, about patriarchal and patronizing approaches of giving voice, let's say, to others, rather than opening up spaces for self-organized expression and emancipatory politics. The aftermath of the October 7 Hamas attacks and the genocidal violence unleashed on Gaza have brought into sharp relief the limits of this existing diversity regime. It has not only shown how Muslims have been racialized, especially in the aftermath of 9/11, but how this process of racialization has served as an essential building block in consolidating the civilizational narrative that Germany, or I should say first West and then a united Germany, has crafted about itself since the end of the Second World War. Perhaps we are now at the end of an arc of the civilizational narrative with the displacement of perpetratorship and with Germany regaining what is called in German Deutungshoheit, interpretive authority, that has been translated into the disregard of civil liberties and basic democratic rights, as for instance my colleague Sultan Dogan has pointed out. As someone who's done extensive research on art, on the arts world, as an institutional formation, I want to go back to the moment of great surprise and disbelief that gripped the worlds of art and culture in Germany in the aftermath of October 7, because it brings into focus common misconceptions about what the German state is or is not and is doing with its cultural policies. It is important to remember this moment especially since in Germany, the entire funding structure for arts and culture is conceptualized as a direct response to the experience of fascism and the devastation of the Holocaust. And it is this funding structure that has long made Germany in general, and Berlin, for instance, in particular, very attractive for international artists. At the heart of this, and this brings us a little bit out of the art world seemingly, but I think I'll come back to it in a moment. One hard piece has always been, for instance, the criminalization of Holocaust denial in Germany as a legitimizing factor for the very existence of the Federal Republic, because it legally cemented the imperative to remember and severed the Republic's ties with National Socialism through what has been called a posture of obsessive mindfulness of its past. And yet, the criminalization of Holocaust in denial in Germany was enacted only in 1985 as an addition to Article 130 of the Penal Code, which deals with incitement of the masses, a fact that is largely forgotten today. Is that this law was only passed in parliament on the insistence of the CDU-CSU, the Christian Democratic Party majority, of another stipulation that also criminalized the denial of the forced expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe. So, what I want to draw attention to here is that Holocaust remembrance in Germany has always been conditional, but that conditionality has been forgotten. It has always been conditional on other things. While central to the refashioning of Germany after 1945, remembrance has been conditional in a way that is not coincidental, and in a way it's not coincidental that shortly after the 1994 codification, Muslim others became the main subject of anti-Semitism and Holocaust education, as many of my colleagues like Sultan Doğan, like Esther Özürek have been working on. So it's really important, I think, to look at how we historically got to this point in order to be able to really take a stance against the rollbacks that we've been experiencing over the past few years. That's why I keep coming back to the historical precedents and the historical roots of cultural policy, official cultural policies, of the frame of what freedom of expression comes to mean in contexts like Germany. So while I don't want to downplay the role of private institutions and sponsors in being able to show alternative positions to official cultural policies or presets, I also want to draw attention to the fact that the antagonism that is very often performed, I would say, between private and public sponsors also is in need of critical investigation. We know this both from Germany, where private sponsors, and I also talk about this in my book, often say, we can do what the German state can't do, what they're not, because their bureaucracy is too cumbersome and it's too slow. Or in Turkey, where private foundations often say, they're the last resort for critical voices. And in both cases, I think these kind of sponsors and private institutions that are often connected to big family monies of questionable provenance have cast themselves really, I think increasingly since the 90s, as civil society actors. But this antagonism is performative insofar as I think a closer look shows that there's more of a division of labor rather than an antagonistic stance between state and private institutions. Of course, if we look at Germany, it's a little bit different because it used to have, and still we'll see how it goes, but the funding cuts that we are hearing about and that have already been enacted seem to really want to put an end to this. Have had a very strong state funding structure. In Turkey, this has played out, of course, in different ways, where the state has largely withdrawn from funding contemporary art and culture. But in all cases, I think the state remains an important actor in shaping the production, circulation, presentation of art, in framing perception. Censorship, again, is one example where we see this most clearly. But we also see it, for instance, in the biennials. The Berlin Biennial, too, is largely funded not through state mechanisms per se, and yet state actors always also claim it as their success. And also very well know how to use the Berlin Biennial for issues around tourism and foreign investment, for instance. That again. And what we've also seen is because these private foundations are also dependent on the state in different measures, or the corporations or the families that are connected to them are also dependent on state structures. We've also seen a lot of anticipatory obedience. Like, it was quite shocking to me, for instance. No, I shouldn't say that. Strike that. It's not shocking. But it was sad to see, I should say, it was sad to see that in Germany, private institutions also didn't step up, where state institutions, for instance, censored Palestinian voices, censored voices for Palestine solidarity over the past 2 years. Indeed, they have acted quite in line and as proxies for state institutions, and have not proven themselves to be the alternatives that they have long made themselves out to be. I wonder how new this situation is in many ways. I don't mean to be a sort of Cassandric, this was long coming kind of voice. On the other hand, the successive rollbacks that we've experienced really since the 1980s have already been messengers of this crisis to come. And I've always thought, in the different contexts that I've worked in, that a dual strategy is important, at least a dual strategy. I always like, in the Turkish context, the feminist slogan, devletten alacağımız var. So the state owes us. And I still think that that's true for the feminist struggle, for queer struggles, for the struggles of an arts and culture that envisions it to be emancipatory. And thus, I do think insisting on critique and insisting on what is ours in the widest sense is very important. Likewise important, it seems to me, the kind of self-organization that we're seeing in places like Turkey, I think, and hopefully we'll see also in places like Germany or Austria. Solidarity building, that's not just about empty forms of I stand in solidarity with you, but that's really organized around shared vulnerabilities. It's really a task of weaving relationships, I think, that makes these kinds of politics possible. Relationships amongst each other, among or with the past, present, and future, to really envision different kinds of producing and showing and sharing art and culture. I think these are the two options that I am able to sort of think about at this point, but I think together they're really important. It's really about also understanding what self-organization might look like and how we can create the resources for that. And we've seen some inkling of this, I think, with the beginning of the pandemic and the question of mutual aid. And we're also seeing it modeled quite impressively, I think, in terms of Palestine solidarity around the world.